Imam al-Khadimi began by defining presence of heart and taught us the basic meaning underpinning why one has presence of heart in the prayer and why one does not have presence of heart in the prayer. And so now he's going to be discussing some of what comes out of having this presence of heart within the prayer. And so he says, وَأَمَّا ثَمَرَاتُ حُضُورِ الْقَلْبِ فَالتَّفَهُمُ. So the first thing he mentions is understanding. And then he says, وَهُوَ مُلَاهَدَةُ الْمَعْنَى مِنَ اللَّفْظِ فِي الْقِرَاءَةِ وَسَائِرِ الْأَذْكَارِ. That it is taking note of the meaning when it comes to the wording of one's recitation and all of one's adhkar within the prayer. فَهَذِهِ هِيَ الصَّلَاةُ الَّتِي تَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ. And so this is the prayer that prevents one from engaging in obscene and evil and objectionable actions. And of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in the Quran, وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةِ فَإِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ تَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ. And so Imam al-Khadimi over here says that this does not apply to just any old prayer that you perform. This applies to a prayer that you perform with khushu', with a connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, understanding what you're saying, understanding the conversation you are having with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you engage in the prayer in that way, then the prayer becomes a means by which fahsha and munkar are averted from you. The means by which you are able to prevent yourself from engaging in evil actions. But if you're performing prayer without any understanding, without any presence of heart, then this promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to materialize for you. And this is why he continues by saying, لا من يقرأ وهو غافل عن معنى ما قرأه. So this does not apply, the prayer being something that prevents you from engaging in evil deeds. This does not apply to someone who recites in prayer while being oblivious to what he is saying. وسببه بعد حضور القلب وصرف الذهن إلى إدراك المعنى. And he says the cause for understanding is to basically have a high degree of presence of heart and to redirect the mind towards trying to understand the meaning of what one is saying. وتشمر لدفع الخواطر الشاغلة بنزع الأسباب التي تنجذب الخواطر إلى الشواغل الدنيوية. And then to make real effort in trying to push away these thoughts that come to one's mind. And the way one does this is you try to remove those things that might be a cause for bringing about these worldly thoughts into your mind during the prayer. فَمَنْ أَحَبَّ شَيْئًا أَكْثَرَ ذِكْرَهُ. And so whoever loves something, he engages in the remembrance of that thing in plenty, in plenitude. وَلِذَلِكَ مَنْ أَحَبَّ غَيْرَ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى لَا تَسْفَوْ لَهُ الصَّلَاةِ عَنِ الْخَوَاطِرِ الرَّضِيَّةِ. And so this is why someone who loves other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, then his prayer is going to suffer from these sort of lowly thoughts and whispers and distractions. فهل يليق للمؤمن أن يجعل غيره تعالى أهم في محل مناجاته معه ويؤثره عليه. And so then he asks Imam al-Khadimi, does it really befit a believer that he makes someone more important than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a context in which he is speaking to Allah? Is this something that befits a believer? That you are in a context, you're in your prayer, this is a conversation between you and your Lord. This is an intimate moment between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you're thinking about other things and other people, which clearly indicates that these other things or other people or other issues, whatever it might be, that they occupy a more important place in your heart than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now over here, this idea of understanding is really critical, because a lot of times our lack of presence of heart within the prayer leads to and results from our inability to connect to the prayer and to understand what's being done in the prayer on a deeper level. And the first level is simply just understanding what we're saying. How many of us, when we're reciting the Fatiha, how many of us really think about what is it that we're saying? Or when we recite a particular surah, or when we say the adhkar in our salah, the tasbihat and ruku' and sujood, how many of us really take a moment while we're reciting to actually think through, what am I saying in this particular moment? What do these words signify? What do they tell me about the action that I'm currently performing? What do they tell me about how am I trying to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And the Quran and the adhkar that the Prophet ﷺ taught us within the prayer and outside of the prayer, everything that the Prophet taught us is about self-reflection in a way that allows us to formulate a more powerful and closer bond and relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a manner that cultivates piety and righteousness and hope and fear and all these other positive emotions and states of being. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, كِتَابٌ أَنزَلْنَاهَ إِلَيْكَ مُبَارَكٌ لِيَدَّبَّرُوا آيَاتِهِ, that this is a blessed book that we have revealed to you. Right? This is a very majestic, blessed book that we have revealed to you so that you may reflect on its verses. And yadabbaru over here, tadabbur refers to really trying to get at the maximum point of reflection, the long term. What is this verse trying to really tell me in terms of not simply what I should do right now in the immediate, but what are all the various meanings that this verse is trying to get at? What is it trying to teach me? And so in our prayer, we should have the same mindset. We should have this mindset that we need to understand what we are saying. And it's not very difficult at all. I mean, it's not like, we're being asked to memorize the whole English translation of the Quran. You read up on the translation of the Fatiha. You understand what's being said in the Fatiha. You understand the few surahs that you might recite in your salah. You read up an English translation or a tafsir on them. You memorize or understand what is being said in your sujood and your ruku' and what they signify. I mean, this is not a very difficult task, and so this is really the first step. This is sort of a baseline that all believers should meet, which is they should understand what they are saying within their prayers, because otherwise the prayer becomes sort of an empty shell, right? It becomes an empty shell, and it has no meaning to you, and it has no meaning in terms of really trying to connect you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, there was a reason why the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ, they would weep in their prayers and they would express various emotions within their prayers because they were constantly reflecting on what they were reciting. They weren't crying because of how melodious the voice was or any of these other things. And of course, these things do have an impact on the human soul, but for the most part, primarily they were moved because of the meaning that underpinned what they were reciting. Sometimes it was about Allah's rahmah, sometimes it was about Jannah, sometimes it was about the fire, sometimes it was about punishment, sometimes it was about humans lacking gratitude. All sorts of things mentioned in the Quran, all sorts of things that one would recite in the salah that would move one. And through these emotions, through these changes of state, one would be able to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on a deeper level. And so that's a very sort of simple thing that we can try to include within our prayers, which is an understanding of the meaning of what we are saying. Then Imam al-Khadimi says, وَالتَّعْظِيم, and then we have reverence. Hudur al-qalb is something that occasions reverence. And Imam al-Khadimi says, فَالتَّعْظِيمُ يَتَوَلَّدُ مِنْ مَعْرِفَةِ جَلَالِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَعَظَمَتِهِ ومعرفة حقارة النفس وكونها مسخرة لربها فيتولد منهما التعظيم والخشوع. So he says التعظيم, which is reverence, it results from knowing the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. and how great He is. And also by knowing the insignificance of the self, and that it is something that is subjugated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when you have both these, when you put these two things together, the majesty of Allah and how great He is and how perfect He is, alongside the insignificance of the self, the insignificance of virtually basically anything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the fact that everything in this cosmic plane is subjugated to Him, submitted to Him, whether knowingly or unknowingly, whether they recognize it or they don't recognize it, then this is what engenders a reverence and khushu' within the heart for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we have awe, wal-haybatu. And hayba he defines as خوف يصدر عن الإجلال يتولد من معرفة كونه تعالى غنيا عن العالمين بحيث لو أهلك أهل العالم كلهم لا ينقص من ملكه ذرة مع نفوذ قدرته. And so he says that hayba or awe is it's a fear that results or arises from ijlal, or arises from this recognition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's immense majesty. And يتولد من معرفة كونه تعالى غنيا, and it results from recognizing or knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the one who is free of all need, right? يا أيها الناس أنتم الفقراء إلى الله والله هو الغني الحميد, as the Quran says, that O mankind, you are the ones who are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then He is free of all need. He is free of all need, and He is the praised one. And so, as Imam al-Khadimi over here mentions, Allah is free of all need in such a way that if He were to destroy everything, this would not diminish His sovereignty or His dominion even one bit. وَكُلَّمَا زَادَ الْعِلْمُ بِاللَّهِ زَادَتِ الْخَشْيَةُ وَالْهَيْبَةُ. And as your knowledge of Allah increases, then your khashya, or your fear and your awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, increases as well. And this idea of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power and freedom of need, of course, is something we recognize as part of Him being the one God. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إن يشأ يذهبكم أيها الناس ويأتي بآخرين وكان الله على ذلك قديرا. That if Allah had willed, then He would have basically replaced you all. He would have gotten rid of everyone, and He would have brought forth others, a new creation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to do this because He is Allah. And over here, hayba is a really interesting concept. Hayba relates to fear, but the Arabic language is very rich, and our tradition is very rich too. We have a lot of words when it comes to this emotion of fear, and they're on different levels and of different intensities, and they arise from, there are different impulses that sort of underpin them. Khawf is sort of a baseline fear that one has, that all mu'minin have. They have a fear of the hellfire. They have a fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punishing them. So there's a baseline khawf that all mu'mineen, or all believers, are meant to have. Khashya is something more specific. Khashya is often translated as fear, but it is actually more specific than khawf. It includes khawf within it, but it is specific to those people who have a higher degree of ilm or ma'rifah. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He mentions khashya in the Quran, He says, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاءُ. That only those people have khashya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, namely the learned. The learned are the only people who have khashya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So khashya is the maqam, or the state of the ulama, that arises from a real knowing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and who He is, and His majesty, and His being the Lord of the worlds. And then we have hayba. And hayba is really interesting because It is an awe, but it is an awe that is mixed with love. And so many of the ulama mention that al-hayba is for the muhibbin. The hayba is something that is the characteristic of those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And hayba arises from ijlal. It arises from this aspect of recognizing the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But ijlal is, according to the ulama, something that comes with mahabbah. It is maqrunatun bil mahabbati. It is something that it goes hand in hand with love, because you express you express this reverence and show this majesty or affirm this majesty for someone who you have love for. And so hayba arises from that ijlal. And one of the differences between khawf and hayba is also khawf makes you run, hayba makes you still. And these are different ways. And the ulama try to explain it by saying that when you see a bear in the woods, sometimes you might be like, oh snap, I have to run out of fear. But sometimes your fear, the reaction that comes about due to fear, is you sort of freeze, you go still. And so they say that hayba is something that it does not instill haraka in you. It does not make you sort of unsettled. Hayba is something that makes you really still. It makes you in a state of sukoon. And this is why it is connected to this idea of khushu as well. And this is why Imam al-Khadimi mentions it in this Risala. But there are some fascinating discussions regarding hayba and khawf and khashya and how they relate to each other. Hayba is like we mentioned, actually a higher level, and it is often paired with uns or intimacy with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas khawf is often paired with raja or hope. And so the Islamic tradition has a very sort of sophisticated and deep understanding of these various concepts, which we cannot get into over here, but it's good to simply point out a few of these things for the benefit of everyone. And then he says hope, ورجاء سببه معرفة لطف الله تعالى وكرمه وعميم إنعامه ومعرفة صدقه في وعده الجنة بالصلاة فيتولد من تلك المعرفة رجاء. So he says, then we have hope. And hope, it's what occasions hope, the cause that gives rise to hope is knowing the subtle love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His generosity, and the general nature and the ampleness of the blessings that He bestows upon everyone. And it also, and one of its asbab, one of the things that causes hope also is knowing knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of His promises is someone who is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not lie. And so when He promises us something, then that is going to be fulfilled in this life or the next. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised Jannah for those who are people of prayer. And so from this knowledge, from the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's nature of giving and His generosity, and from the knowledge of what He has promised us for engaging in prayer, hope arises. And this sense of hope is, of course, something that is cultivated by having hudrul qalb, or presence of heart, in the prayer. And so we have various verses in the Quran and numerous statements in the Sunnah as well regarding hope. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about those who strive in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's way and those who emigrate for Allah, that أُولَٰئِكَ يَرْجُونَ رَحْمَةَ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ, that these are people who hope for the mercy of Allah, and Allah is the forgiving and the merciful. And of course, the very famous verse in the Quran that instills hope in all of us, that, O my slaves who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair. لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله إن الله يغفر الذنوب جميعا إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. That Allah is the one who forgives all sins, and He is the one who is the most merciful and the one who forgives. So that is hope. And the ulama, again, they have various ways of expressing hope. Hope can, again, manifest in different ways. And it is often paired with khawf, as you mentioned. And khawf and raja are seen as sort of the two pillars upon which the amal of the mu'min rests. And so too much hope makes one idle, and too much fear makes one despondent. And so there's always a balance that needs to be struck. And then hope and the raja, when they are cultivated, they become hayba and uns. They become awe and intimacy with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then when those are further cultivated, the hayba becomes jalal, and the uns, or the intimacy with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, becomes jamal, majesty and beauty. And so if you recall a few lessons ago, we mentioned that human beings are in one way created in the divine image. And so we are able to reflect these aspects of jamal and jalal within ourselves, because we also have a ruh, which is of a heavenly origin. And so we can cultivate these character traits within ourselves. And the aim of the human being is always to be in this balanced state. A balance between hope and fear, a balance between awe and intimacy, a balance between beauty and majesty. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you look at His names, this is what you find. A being of utter perfection, characterized by Jamal and Jalal. And so hope has a very important function in that regard for the human being in terms of developing himself spiritually and forming that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another one of the great Sufi saints defined hope as the consolation of the heart in anticipation of seeing God's generosity. So the heart has this consolation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His generosity will manifest. And when you look at some of the stories that have been related about the ulama on their deathbeds, you will find that some of them had an overwhelming sense of fear, others had an overwhelming sense of hope. And so it is said, for example, that Malik ibn Anas, when he was on his deathbed, some of his companions came to him and asked him, how do you find yourself? And Malik simply replied that the hope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is vast. And so he was entering into that domain of the next world with a sense of hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Abu Sa'id al-Sa'luki, another famous sheikh, early sheikh, when he passed away, he was seen in a dream. And Abu Sa'id al-Sa'luki, he was of the opinion, he held this opinion of eternal punishment, divine punishment for sinners, even amongst Muslims. And so when someone saw in a dream, someone saw him in a dream and asked him, what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do to you? What is your state right now? He simply responded, things over here are easier than I thought. And so again, an indication of that's a story that ulama tell to instill hope into people and to show them the generosity and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we have shame, which is the last one that Imam al-Khadimi mentions, وَالْحَيَاءُ سَبَبُهُ استشعار التقصير في العبادة. And it's what instills this sense of shame is recognizing the deficiency in one's act of worship or acts of worship. وعلمه بالعجز عن القيام بتعظيم حق الله عز وجل, and the individual's knowledge of his inability, his complete inability to fulfill what is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? سيما إذا عرف عيوب نفسه وقلة إخلاصه وميلها إلى حظ العاجل في جميع أفعاله، مع العلم بعظيم جلال الله تعالى وبأنه مطلع على خواطر القلب وإن دقت، وهذه المعارف إذا حصلت يقينا انبعث منها الحياء. And so then he says basically that this is especially the case when one recognizes the the deficiencies of oneself and one's lack of ikhlas, and coupled with knowledge of how grand and perfect and majestic Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is someone who is aware of all of our states, the states of our heart, the whispers of our heart, our distractions. And when we recognize this, when we couple these two sides, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is and who we are, then this gives rise to a state of haya or shame. And this is why, and basically in this description, Imam al-Khadimi is making reference to various verses in the Quran, such as "Inna Allah kana alaykum raqiba," that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is someone who is ever watchful over you. And so when He's ever watchful over us, we recognize that there is nothing, all of our imperfections are known to Him. He knows that our salah is imperfect. He knows that we're thinking about our job or our car or our bills or whatever it might be within our salah. We're perpetually in a state of ghafla on some level or the other. And we cannot hide these states and these deficiencies from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so recognizing that, coupled with recognizing who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is and what He deserves in terms of worship, and then recognizing the state of our worship, that should bring about a state of shame. And this is why Imam al-Junayd said, when you see both the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and your shortcomings, then there emerges between them the state known as shame. Because you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sustaining you, He is giving you your sustenance, He has given you life, He has given you a home, He has given you family, He has given you wealth, He has given you well-being, He has given you so much. So much. He has given you the tawfiq to get up and do wudu and perform your salah and to keep your fast, and given you all the opportunities in the world to turn to Him and worship Him. And we see these favors day in and day out. Everything we do, every breath we take is a favor from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and yet our ibadah is still as poor as ever. And it will of course never be at that stage where it can even compensate for anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ exerted himself as much as he could in worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أَفَلَا أَكُونُ عَبْدًا شَكُورًا. Should I not be a thankful slave? And so there's a sense of shame that the mu'min has when he engages in his ibadah, and he recognizes that there are shortcomings in it, and he recognizes that this is simply not in keeping with what befits Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what He deserves. And this is why, when we looked at the states of some of the early Muslims, you would see the description of Ibrahim al-Nakhai, that he would, after prayer, he would sit down like he was sick. He seemed like he was a sick person. And that was because these early Muslims, they had a sense of, they came out of prayer and they recognized that, I've prayed, but there's nothing I can do to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala properly and submit to Him properly for what He has given me. And so when you recognize the favors of Allah and then your own shortcomings, this sense of shame arises. And with that, inshallah, we'll end this class. So those were 5 states that Imam al-Khadimi linked to this idea of hudur al-qalb. These are states that arise from having presence of heart in the prayer, and that you have a sense of, you understand your prayer, you understand what you're saying, you understand your actions, you have a sense of hope, a sense of awe, a sense of reverence, and a sense of shame. And all of these sort of come together within the prayer, that where the individual has presence of heart, and in turn these character traits also themselves engender presence of heart as well. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us with these noble states, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to perfect our acts of worship and allow us to recognize His favors and His majesty, His greatness, His perfection, and to recognize our own deficiencies and try our best to submit to Him in the way that He has demanded. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.